Kung and reform in the church. Just note for you, there's no lecture next week, being Memorial Day weekend, and on the back of the handouts it reminds you that there is one more on June 1st. We're talking about the great Protestant theologian of the 20th century, Karl Barth, who we just had his 100th birthday this past week. So we have signs up, and anyone else will find their way, huh? Okay, we want to talk a little bit about Hans Kung, and I think it's sort of fascinating to look at him and to figure out, what he has to say to us. It seems to me that by and large he is a spokesman for the progressive wing in the church. In a sense, to look at the life of Hans Kung, for many people in the room, it is to relive our personal history, to have a way of articulating what has gone on with us. He has been sort of with us in a journey ever since before the Second Vatican Council and up to our own time. The signs must be working. People are finding their way. A lot of people don't know where the moot courtroom is. It's a trial. It's actually a heresy trial that we're having here. I thought it would be appropriate for the Hans Kung lecture. So Kung is sort of lived with us and articulated for us in the Catholic community the whole journey from before the Second Vatican Council up to the present time. His books seem to have been very timely. They've been written in connection with the real problems that people have been experiencing. They are a way of saying, I suppose, what the battles and struggles have been in the church in the last years since the council. Now, what I want to do is to let him move us to reminisce a bit or go back over that history. And I'll take his own life sort of in stages and and then his writings, and to see what light they throw on things for us. So the first question I have in mind is, how do we deal with the classical elements in the church? How do we deal with authoritarianism in the church, the institutional model of the church? How do we come to terms with the way the church was before the Second Vatican Council? Well, how do we take that long history? How do we take that rather rigid structure, authoritarian system that many of us grew up in and knew? What sense of it do we make? How do we integrate it into who we are today? And for some people, that is a sort of an historical question. That is, they've made that whole process work. They've come to terms with the previous age and are happily living in the church now. There's other people who pine for those old days, who wonder why it can't be like that anymore. I think I saw some letters in the Chronicle recently that suggested maybe that kind of attitude of getting back to a previous age. Now, for young people, all this kind of material is history, and for some it's almost ancient history. I always have to keep reminding myself of that in teaching the collegians. It's outside of their experience. It's always a shock to think that they don't remember when John Kennedy got shot, and it's just hard for us to imagine, or the calling of the Second Vatican Council. So, and I talked to a certain number of young people who still are looking for that classical church in a way, looking for the more authoritarian structures that we knew in the past. So that's the first question, it would seem to me, that Kung can help us with. How do we come to terms with that authoritarian classical age in the church? Now, Hans Kung lived through that. He was born, I think, in 1928. To locate him a bit, it's hard to imagine him being 57 or 58 years old. I mean, he somehow seems younger than that to me, vigorous and alive and all of that. But so Kung, and he is Swiss, which is sort of important in his own history. Switzerland has more of a history of freedom in the church. In fact, I think all through the modern times that they've had a say in the choice of the bishop of some of their major sees, Basel, for example, in Switzerland. So there's a sort of different sense of church in Switzerland than perhaps we would find in Germany or in other parts of the world. But anyway, he grew up as a Swiss. He's a member of the Diocese of Basel. And at one point he decided to study for the diocesan priesthood. And he was sent off to Rome to do his studies, and he was in a very authoritarian structure there. It's probably hard for some people to realize what the seminaries were like in those days. Almost all aspects of one's life was regimented. One got up at an hour, a particular time, and lights went off at a certain hour, and it was just a very rigid kind of setup. And Kung lived in that, and my own reading of it is largely bought into that, which is, I think, one of the first questions that one asks about oneself. In that church, did one sort of buy into those authoritarian structures? Now, speaking personally, one of the things I always have to work a little bit at getting a feel for people who have had trouble making the transition, because for me, I really never did buy into those authoritarian structures. I was in the seminary at that same time. And I think for me it was always sort of a game as to how to break all of those legalisms. I remember when my folks would come and visit me, we would just sort of drive off. You weren't allowed to do that, but we'd drive off someplace to go to a restaurant or get a drink or something. And it was, so, as I went through all of that, I somehow felt all along the line that none of that really made sense, that it wasn't the proper way to live. So I never really lived through the kind of trauma that many people have in making this transition. I can remember, for example, the many textbooks we had. I never bought any books. And my classmates always thought that was funny, that I would never buy any books. And the reason was because I knew they were of no value. Now, I don't know how I knew that. I really don't know how I knew that. I know why I didn't buy into the authoritarianism and the legalism and so on. It was largely out of my family structure. But I couldn't, how I knew about the theology, I really don't understand that. I didn't know what to put in its place, but I knew that it wasn't too valuable, not valuable enough to buy the books anyway. So, anyway, Hans Kung, as I read it, sort of did buy into that system in a way. At least he lived it out and was pretty rigid in his own attempts to follow out those kinds of legalisms. Well, then he was ordained out of that whole situation, I think in 1954. Some of this seems to be a little vague in my mind, but I think he was ordained in 1954. And then after that, he spent a little bit of time doing some pastoral work. He's done about a total of 18 months pastoral work in a parish. That's how he thought of himself. That's what he was going to do. He was going to be a parish priest in some little towns in Switzerland, and that was his full expectation. He spent about 18 months doing that, which he says himself was very influential on him and really did shape a lot of it. In other words, he got enough of the pastoral sense to know what ordinary people were thinking and what their problems were with the church. And then after that, he was sent away for further studies. He went to Paris to the Institut Catholique and studied there, and he did his doctoral dissertation on the great Protestant theologian Karl Barth, who we're going to talk about 2 weeks from tonight. And this is where Kung proved himself not to be an ordinary person at all. Most people write a doctoral dissertation, at the end of it people say, who cares, and they throw it away or something. But for Kung, it was altogether different. His doctoral dissertation was revolutionary. It was a great breakthrough in the whole history of the Protestant Catholic debate. So for over 400 years, Catholics and Protestants were debating the fundamental issue of justification. How are we justified? Is it through works or through God's grace? Big debate and defensive attitudes. Well, Kung wrote his dissertation on Karl Barth's notion of justification and related it to the Catholic notion of justification. When he finished his dissertation, he showed it to Karl and showing how they were reconciled, how they could be put together. There wasn't a controversy after 400 years that really wasn't a different position. Could be reconciled. And so, well, the immediate thing is, well, he fudged this in some way. But Karl Barth looked at it and said, yes, he has honestly represented my opinion. It's a masterful work. Karl Rahner looked at it on the Catholic side and said, yes, he has represented properly the Catholic position. And therefore, he made in his original scholarly work, made this tremendous breakthrough to show how this whole business of faith and works and how God's grace works with us and so on can be brought together and unified, and we don't have to be divided over it. And in a sense, that opened up Kung's mind to a whole new world, liberated him, in a sense, from that seminary training that he had had, and gave him his opportunity to do some really careful and good critical theological studies. It sort of set his life task. That is, to take the great issues that need reformation in the church, that need rethinking, and sort of one by one attack them very systematically to show how Protestants and Catholics could come together, how the church could get itself together, how it could be united in order to make a better witness in the modern world. So we're dealing with a man with a mission. I think once he got started, he's a man of dedicated purpose. He knows what he is about, and it is a whole program that he has in mind. He thinks big. In that sense, he partakes, I think, of a certain greatness. Well, after that work, we move into the period of the time of the calling of the council by Pope John the 23rd in 1959. Now, I remember writing a paper in around 1960 myself, saying that the council would not amount to much, that it would be a rubber stamp, that the people would get to Rome, the bishops would get to Rome, and it was all cut and dried, and they would sign these statements, and everyone would go home, and it would be pretty much business as usual. Very perceptive article, as I remember it. Now, at the same time, Hans Kung was writing a book called The Council, Reform and Reunion, which was published in 1961. You remember the council started in 1962. And Kung said, this council's got the potential to be a great moment in the history of the church. That we have the opportunity here for tremendous reform. And he wrote this, marvelous work. A lot of it was based on the thought of Yves Congar, who had written much before him. But Kung, as usual, was in touch with the situation. He understood the historical trends and the opportunities that were there. That book made him famous in the United States. That's probably the first time a lot of people ever heard of him, and that Council, Reform, and Reunion. It alerted many of us to what might happen in the council. And so he used his great historical sense, and as much of Kung's work is to take a question and trace its history. And so what he did in this book is trace the history of reform in the church. And he pointed out how there were a lot of times in history when things were messed up and not going well, and the church rallied, and there would be a council, or there'd be another event, and people would help shape up the church. And so by doing that whole historical background, he came to the sense, well, something good could happen here. He was very early on to the importance of John the 23rd and his symbolic efforts. He was taken by John the 23rd. It's one of his heroes, just like John Kennedy is one of Hans Kung's heroes. Again, he sort of partakes of another age. That's not the kind of statement that probably Karl Rahner would make, for example. So Kung is of the younger age after those great theologians like Rahner and Lonergan and even Schillebeeck. He's sort of the next generation. and he's more in tune with the modern world. So his heroes are John the 23rd and John Kennedy. But he could see that John the 23rd had tremendous insight and that he wanted to move the church forward. He was very much in tune to all of the great things that he did. You know, simple things like even before he officially declared it, when he had the Good Friday liturgy and he got to that phrase, the perfidious Jews, he just on his own dropped that phrase. Later on he dropped it for everybody, of course. John the 23rd was always doing the symbolic things that you could miss. Like people argued that you couldn't change the canon of the Mass, that it was sacrosanct, you couldn't tamper with it in any way. So one day he simply added a word to it. He added Joseph's name, as I recall. And just to show anybody who's really alert, oh yeah, you can change it. Well, because I just did it. So that, and Hans Kung was very good at picking that up. He saw that the Pope really meant business despite all of the problems. Then the other point that I pick up in the book is the great importance of the church being self-critical, which is a theme that he continues to work throughout. So when Kung writes about the church, it sounds so different from what we would have learned in the seminary. When we learned it in the seminary, the church was called the perfect society. It was a perfect society. There was a whole lot of talk about the holiness of the church, of the oneness of the church. Everyone held the same things in the church. You could travel all around the world and go to Mass any place, and it would be exactly the same. Well, the priest probably would stand there with his hands just like this, in any place you went. So what Kung said was that it's not a perfect church. It's a sinful church, and the church had to be self-critical. And he brought up that phrase which was then worked into the council. The church must always be reforming itself. Must always happen that way. And of course, throughout the book, he had that it wasn't just renewal for the sake of renewal, but renewal for the sake of reunion. Council reform and reunion. So that he was always looking to say, how could the Catholics and Protestants get together on all of this? And he felt that the real way that we were going to do that was not compromising the truth, but each group renewing itself. Not restoring old things, renewing itself. So he had it in that image in there. He said the church is the building of God, the basilica, the temple of God. And he said so that what the council had to do was not tear it down and rebuild it, nor just paint it up a little bit, fix it up in spots, but what we had to do was do a thorough renewing of this church. That was his image. So Kung has always seen himself not as a revolutionary. He's always distinguished himself out from the revolutionaries, the one who want to tear it all down and start over. He has always thought of himself as a reformer. So that's some of the things that he had to say in the council reform and reunion. Now, which he wrote, I remind you, in 1960, and it was published in 1961. Again, I can tell throughout his life he's always been thinking of making an impact. I mean, I don't think Kung ever just sat down and decided, well, I'll write a book. He always had a purpose. I think he thought he could influence the council. He was, I might say, an expert at the council. He was not, at the beginning of the first session, he was somehow bypassed and was not named. But during the first session, he was then named as one of the periti, the experts at the council. So he had a close role to play in all of that. He gave lectures to the bishops, as did a number of the theologians. People looked up to him at that time. He was seen as a rising, promising young theologian, and I think did make an impact. Now, what might all of that mean? Well, I mean, one thing it does for many people in the room is to take us back historically to where we were before the Second Vatican Council, what the church was like. That's sort of a nostalgia trip in many ways. That's like a long time ago now, but it is interesting to think of that. One of the things we'd have to figure out is that we come to terms with that. One way that people have trouble coming to terms with it is sort of feeling upset about it, maybe being guilty about it, or being angry about what the church did to them throughout that period of time. For other people, it's sort of a pining, like, I wish it could be stable and set and in order again as it was once before. I think perhaps what Kung does is give us a perspective on the Second Vatican Council, to remind us of the great changes that it did institute. And before long, we're going to go on with this history and catch us all the way up to date, because Kung has continued to write up to our own time. But let's take a little break there. I invite you to do our one-to-one discussion for a couple minutes and maybe just see what memories that brings back, or what sort of perspectives it gives you on the time before the council and that period of reform there. Let's take a couple minutes to do that. To make out of that, sort of a smaller, more compact group. If people want to ask anything or comments are welcome as well. No. Yeah, I mean, I was trying to be just a little cautious on that. That's my reading of it. I mean, I never heard him say that, or it's some of the comments about how he sort of was a model student at at the college in Rome, and so on. That's what makes me think that. Now, I believe that, again, that for him, a lot of getting out of it would be built into his psyche because of growing up in Switzerland, where there's a certain openness to begin with, and maybe a little different sense that the church isn't quite as authoritarian as we might see in other places, and that the whole mindset isn't quite as rigid or authoritarian as we would find in other places. So I presume that helped him. I think, too, the key is his passion for truth. There's a sort of a biography. It's not told or anything, but it's titled that. It's by Robert Noel, a journalistic type, A Passion for Truth, Hans Kung and His Theology. And I think that is a very apt title, A Passion for Truth, because that really does govern his life. And I believe that is, what has driven him and has moved him to be critical of things. In other words, he's very open to studying the history of questions. And when you study the history of questions, it relativizes the way things are done now. I think of the people who made the changes around the time of the Second Vatican Council, and I remember being involved in many CFM groups, and I was an associate pastor in St. Mary's, Sandusky at the time, and went through this with so many people. And to me, there were a couple of keys to it. One is that if people could overcome their emotional problems, first of all. I mean, very often it was emotional, that they're taking something away from me, I'll be insecure, I won't have something to hang on to. So that is a major problem. And that often got handled by being in a group, by being with others who were also struggling with these same problems. That seemed to help. But then to bring in the historical side of it was often beneficial. So there are many people upset they're going to change the Mass, they're going to invent these new things. But then if we could show them that actually that's the way the Mass was celebrated in the early centuries, that it was celebrated facing the people, that people received in their hand, that there was a greeting of peace, that there was a sort of looser atmosphere about it all, certain spontaneity. When we're able to show that historically, then people say, oh, well, it's not just creating something new, it is a renewal. It's going back to how things were done before. That seemed to be one of the most effective devices for helping people. So they realized that any historical study relativizes the current situation. The reason some people didn't want to change time of the Second Vatican Council was they thought it was always done that way. They thought the Mass was always that way, where it has been that way only for a limited period of time. It's like confession. People think that people throughout the whole history of the church went once a week or once a month. As a matter of fact, the people used to go once in their lifetime, and in the 4th century, when someone suggested maybe you should go twice, they wanted to convict them of heresy. So for a long time, any historical studies begin to show how practices that we have maybe haven't always been done that way. And Kung had a keen historical sense, still does, and used it throughout. Many of his books really amount to long historical studies of particular questions, and then immediately begin to see there's other options and ways of solving it. So I think that's how he worked his way out. And I think that the key, again, as I found for many people, was largely emotional. That is, could you deal with the insecurities, the threat, the feeling that like I was wrong for a period of time or something, and move beyond that. Yeah, Kung's a really good model for that, I think. Moves us through that period. Now, into the period when the council did get going then, he was an expert, was in Rome, was involved in those discussions, saw all of the things that were going on. He himself had hoped that the council would not get started so soon. He saw the problem again. He saw that the preparatory commissions were drafting these very conservative documents, and that the council was in trouble. It needed time to get good documents prepared so when the bishops got to Rome, they'd have something substantial to discuss. That didn't happen. It got called fairly soon, got started in 1962. He did his bit to try to move it forward. At the end of it, he felt, I think, fairly good about that. I think it was in 1963 during that time that he made a lecture tour of the United States and again began to make an impact on our country. He then came, then the council ended, and near the end of the council he began writing a couple of different books. One was called Structures of the Church, which was published in English then, and I noted that Cardinal Cushing wrote the foreword to it, and Cardinal Cushing said then what a bright coming theologian this young guy was, and he was terrific, and how he appreciated his visits to the United States and all this fine theological work that he was doing. That's a rather somewhat difficult book, but the other book that he wrote then became more popular, called The Church. And I think what was interesting about the preface to that book was that there's a line in there where Kung says that he wants to express his great gratitude to Joseph Ratzinger for all of the help he gave him and his friendship throughout all of that time. Some people might know Ratzinger and Kung don't get along all that well now. It shows how things have changed a bit over the years. So he wrote that book, The Church, and also another one called Truthfulness in the Church. What do you call it? Truthfulness, the Future of the Church. Well, in 1967, so he was writing these books, and they appeared when the church appeared around 1968, I think it was. No, 1964. No, I got those dates all messed up. In German, 1967. Well, in 1967, he came to New York and was a lecturer at Union Theological Seminary, and that's when I first met Hans Kung. I had him in class. He taught a class on ecumenical sacramentology, which was taught, it was probably the only sacramental course that anyone had had in recent memory that began with a study of Luther's works on the sacraments. This was a rather odd thing. I mean, in seminary days you would have never begun by reading Luther's works on the sacraments. But that was Kung's approach again. His great interest was to show how you could look at the sacraments and say they're not a point of division. I can still remember how he was lecturing in class. He would type out his lectures. In those days, his English was a little bit hard to understand. Lectures would all be typed out. They'd be becoming the chapters of his book, like all the German theologians do. That's how they write these books. And he was telling us about that this doesn't have to be a point of division. You know, we always had, well, Catholics say there's 7 sacraments, and Lutherans say there's 3, and the Reformed wing says there's 2. And he was trying to get us beyond that. He tried again, always historically, tried to show us how in the Council of Trent debated that. They didn't take up the issues at all. Throughout the whole history of the church, the number of sacraments was disputed all the way into the Middle Ages. Some thought there was 5, 9, 11, 4, about any number you can think of. They thought there were that many sacraments. And so suddenly in the Council of Trent, without any discussion of that history, without any debate about what Luther had said and so on, said, well, there's 7 of them. And it's just blanket kind of statement. So he taught us the history of that kind of question. And then he tried to show us how we could reconcile those 2 positions, how there was a way to understand it so that we could come together on it, so that Catholics could say, well, there's 2 major sacraments, baptism and Eucharist, like the Protestants think. And then there's these other 5 sacraments that the Protestants would want to celebrate with us, like marriage and so on. Well, I mean, I don't know if you can appreciate it. It was exciting things in those days. This is 1967. You know, it's like opening up doors. It's like thinking, geez, we got all these. I had been a pastor in a parish or co-pastor, or what do we call them, associate pastor for 5 years before that. And, you know, those were issues that, you know, divided us from the Protestant community there. And suddenly here's a man saying, we don't have to be divided on this. So, anyway, during that same time while he was in New York, he gave this series of lectures in the Riverside Church, which became this book, Truthfulness. I heard him give these lectures. And I mean, it was just a marvelous thing. There'd be, I don't know how many, over 1,000 people there, jammed into the Riverside Church. All the time he was in New York, the Catholic community, as far as I know, made almost no use of him, or didn't have him give lectures and so on. That was a non-denominational church where he lectured. I don't know, I wanted just to read a little bit. He's talking about theologians in the church. I remember the cadences. Well, some of you have heard him talk. I mean, to me, he is a powerful speaker. I remember hearing him one time, and I said, if he wants to march someplace, I'm going with him. You know, I mean, he's just a charismatic kind of person, I think, at least he strikes me that way. He's talking about a theologian, how he will live and be, but I think it's a statement about how all Christians might want to be. I'll have to transpose the language here. They will be neither silent nor mutinous. They will be neither intimidated nor be goaded on. They will neither permit their obedience to be exploited nor ever forget their place in the community of faith. They will neither retract what they know to be true nor revolt against the church. They will rather express their view in the right way and before the right public. Both are important, and they will enter into the discussion fearlessly and with a detached serenity, waiting patiently before making their definitive judgment. It could be a long time. And in the course of time, it will become clear where the truth lies, with them, with the church, or there are so many half-truths with both. Well, somehow that gives me a sense of the man, that passion for truth. Those lectures, were just dynamic to me. I mean, there were powerful things about integrity, of conscience, of living by principle, of doing what you're supposed to do, even if it runs into trouble, or people don't understand it, or if you get attacked. It doesn't make any difference. And I think that Kung really has been an example of that throughout his life. So what we get here from these books, the question that I have in mind now is, well, what is this church of ours? If we moved out of another church, then what kind of a church were we supposed to live in 1965, 67? How was it supposed to be? And if we're going to figure out what kind of church it would be, what's our criteria for making that judgment? How do you decide how to change it? And what's it supposed to be like? I mean, you just say, well, we'll make it more like life in the United States, or we'll make it more democratic because we want to make it that way, or we'll make it relevant. Well, how do you do that? What's your basis for judgment? And that's where Kung, really begins to make a strong statement, and one that I think has continuously got him in trouble. Because in borrowing now mostly from his book, The Church, which would be the single best source for this material that I'm looking at here, he says that the real criterion for making judgments about how the church is and what it should be is Jesus Christ, as witnessed in the gospel, as found in the New Testament. That's always the norm. I just picked out of my files an interview with me back when Hans Kung was in the Blade, when Hans Kung was what do I want to say? His canonical mission was taken away to be a teacher. And I was saying in the interview that the thing that I remember most about Kung was that everything that he looked at was always in relationship to what it said in the Scriptures. It was either flowing from it, according to it, or opposed to it. Now, in that way, you see, Kung becomes very much like a Protestant theologian. But people's doctoral dissertations usually shape their outlook on things because they're so intense and you work at them so hard, and it becomes your fundamental way of looking at life very often, at least people who do serious ones. And for Kung, you remember he did it on a Protestant theologian, Karl Barth, who was very big on the fact that there's only that one norm, Jesus Christ as represented in the Scriptures. And therefore, everything else you've got to look at in the light of that. And that's really, when we get down to it, what ends up getting Kung in trouble with the Catholic community very often. Because the bishops wanted him to get into that framework more of a criterion of the teaching authority of the church. And Kung never has wanted to grant that entirely. He's always back, is it in the Scriptures or not? It sounds like our Protestant friends would approach questions. Bible, that's the judge. Now we'll see if it's in there or not. If it isn't, we'll see if it's at least in line with it or according to it. Then we might go along with it. But if it seems to be opposed to it, then we have to be against it. So that becomes Kung's methodology as he tries to look at the question of the church and what's it supposed to be like. And of course, doing it that way, he's going to come up with very different answers than people have traditionally come up with. So I'll try to summarize a little bit of that book, The Church, for you to give a feeling for it. I might preface this by saying that I don't think it's the dominant way of looking at things. In other words, Kung, in a sense, Kung's writing is very ad hoc. It's very much big at the time. I'm not so sure how much of it seems to endure. So if most Catholics today, when they're talking about the church, or guys who popularize theology and so on, go to Avery Dulles' book, The Models of the Church, to really do that. I don't know too many people who go back and directly quote or use the framework that Kung established in his book, The Church. But at the time, what he tried to do is to pull it all together and show us how we could reform ourselves and where we were supposed to go. So in part one of the book, he talks about the church as it is. He's very big always on trying to get at the reality. He insists that the church is a mixture of grace and sin, that there's sort of an ideal image of what the church should be, but there's also the fact of the way it is. And that church is messy. It doesn't do things right. It's always in need of renewal. So right away he wants to locate us in the real struggles. See, much of the other writing about the church would be very idealistic. The church is this beautiful, the bride of Christ, and so on, adorned, splendor to meet the bridegroom, and so on. Kung's talk is to begin talking about how the church is messed up, how it's sinful, how there's mistakes made, how there's errors in the church. He wants to root us in that kind of reality. Then in part two of the book, he talks about the coming reign of God. He talks about Jesus preaching not the church, but the kingdom. Very important to Kung to make that distinction, to distinguish out the kingdom from the church. Play that out a little bit. Jesus did not come to set up an organization and say, well, here's how we're supposed to do it, gang. You know, we have a boss in Rome, and he's got a curia, and so on. We've got a bishop here and there. We got this flow chart. Well, Jesus didn't do that. Jesus preached the kingdom. Said a little about the church. In fact, one of the questions would be, did Jesus in any real sense found the church? And Kung's answer to that is threefold. He says, well, Jesus clearly, and before the resurrection, did not found a church. Secondly, he says he did lay the foundation for the church, in a way, by picking the 12 and so on. And thirdly, that immediately with the resurrection, the group of followers existed that we can think of as the church. So it's those three things that he would put before us. So he wants to insist now that this church, therefore, is not the kingdom. Jesus preached the kingdom. The kingdom is where there's peace and justice, where there's righteousness, and where God's love prevails. That's God's work. That's the Spirit. The church, as he constantly keeps insisting, is a human organization. It's a fellowship of people, of the baptized. He doesn't even like to call the church a divine human institution, as many have done. No, he wants to insist the church is a human institution, a human community made up of flesh and blood people. Therefore, it cannot be the kingdom. But how does it relate to the kingdom then? Well, Kung likes to think of it as the herald of the kingdom. Interesting metaphor again, because that's the dominant Protestant way of thinking about what the church is. It's that the church is the herald of the kingdom. Its job is to proclaim it, to say that the kingdom is coming, and so on. That's the direction that Kung liked to go in. So, that would be his major point, it seems to me, in that section of the book. Coming reign of God. Jesus preached the kingdom, but what happened is that the church formed after the resurrection, the community of followers, their job was to proclaim this kingdom. Then he goes into what he would call the fundamental structures of this church. And he uses three major images or concepts of the church. Now, this is in a day before there was talk of models. Kung wasn't into this idea of models, which is many of us find very effective. He is more recently. When he lectured up in Ann Arbor, he used the idea of models. But he takes three major ones: the people of God, the church. Secondly, the church is a creation of the Spirit. And thirdly, the church is the body of Christ. We've got three major ways. He thinks in those ways he can look at all the main ideas of what the church is. First of all, the church is the people of God. He says that's the oldest and most fundamental concept of the church. It grows out of the experience of the Israelites. The Jewish people is thinking of themselves as God's people. And so when we begin to talk about the people of God, we begin to see that all are equal, that there's no room for any clericalism in the church. Kung's always been against that notion of a privileged position for the priests and for the bishops. So all are equal in the people of God. All of the people belong through God's call. So there's no room for any sort of private or exclusive notions of the church, sense of privilege. It's like we've got it made. It's a sense, rather, we're called by God into this existing group, into this community. We become part of it. Even if we decide to become part of it, it's still only through God's call. My comment here, again, Kung is very big on that Protestant notion. In the debate between Protestants and Catholics, it's always been the Protestant emphasis has been on God's initiative, grace alone. In the Catholic world, there's always been more of a sense of merit, of doing good works, of doing good things, in a sense, to win God's favor. When you read Kung, the Protestant side predominates. The Protestant side of God's initiative. God is doing it. It's God's grace. He creates the church. He does all of this. It's His grace that is at work. That's a good corrective to what I think is sort of the dominant Catholic way of thinking. In many ways, Kung is influenced by that original dissertation on Karl Barth, which we'll see about in 2 weeks. So all belong through God's call. We also all belong through our own decision. So that because of this, there is no room in his mind for thinking of the church as somehow a mediating institution between God and us, which is, I think, maybe the way many people sort of think of it. There's God and there's us, and the church is in there to sort of facilitate that or to mediate that. And Kung says, no, you can't think of the church that way. That you have to think the church is us. It's not a mediating institution. It's we human beings, our fellowship together. And he insists that we are a pilgrim people. There's no room for talking about a sinless church or a perfect church. So those are some of the notes that he develops when he's talking about the church as the people of God. He wants that to be the dominant mode of thinking about the church. That's the great image. And of course the Second Vatican Council picked that up. That's pretty common these days. I would have certain problems with it, however. One of the problems I have with it is that it begins to sound, to be exclusive again. I mean, what does it sound like to a person who doesn't belong to the church when you call the people in the church the people of God? In other words, it makes that person sound like she doesn't belong, like she's not a member of the people of God. So that image itself, which is so popular with many people, also I think has to be critiqued, because it ends up in sort of an exclusivism again, as though only the baptized who believe in Christ belong to the people of God. All these other people out here, the Muslims, or the Jews, or the Hindus, the Buddhists, the atheists, that they would not be a member of this particular community. So I would want to critique that a bit. The second one is the church as a creation of the Spirit. Now here, he does a marvelous job about talking about freedom. Freedom is very important. Kung is very big on not getting carried away with this. Again, in many ways, he is a moderate. I said in that interview I noticed in the Blade that I called him a conservative theologian. And in many ways, he really is. In this section, he's very afraid of the enthusiasts, of people getting carried away like the fundamentalists. And I notice in the church what he says is that when you encounter those enthusiasts, those people who think they have a special claim on the Spirit and so on, what you've got to do is to go back to the fundamentals and stress the belief in Jesus Christ and in the gospel. And I saw that work. When he visited and gave his lecture here, there was, after his lecture over in the Union, he came over to our house, and some students came up to me afterwards and wanted to talk to them, and they told me that when they were driving home from the lecture, they had been convicted by the Spirit to come back and to challenge or straighten out Dr. Kung. Well, he was in the house, and I told him this. These people wanted to see him, and I thought he'd say, well, get rid of them. I don't really want to talk to them. And he said, oh, no, I'd be happy to talk to them. He said, I love to talk to those people. So he goes out, and they began to say, well, we didn't think that you stressed Christ enough. Oh, he said, Christ, Jesus Christ is the center of the whole thing. You've got to get this straight. Christocentric. No, that's where it's at. No, it's all based on Christ. And he just went after them like gangbusters. There's a step back. And then they said, well, you didn't have that idea of the Bible in there enough. The Bible's the norm for everything. It's the thing you make your decisions on. And he's like gangbusters again. And then they said something like, thank you, and went off. It was a very interesting encounter. I mean, I sort of stood in the background and just observed this, how he operated. But it's exactly what he said in the book. When you deal with the enthusiasts, that's his word, throughout all of history, you've had those people like that. It's not a new phenomenon in that sense. But that one, in dealing with the enthusiasts, must go back to the fundamental structures of the faith, the belief in Christ, the biblical norm, so on. And I saw him do that in practice. It was quite interesting. Then, the third image that he uses, or notion as he calls it, is the church as the body of Christ. Now, that some people remember that was the dominant image that was used before the council. When people were in the CFM before the council and or in study groups and so on, the church as the mystical body of Christ is the common way of speaking about it. And Kung picks that up, although he doesn't like that word mystical. He wants to get that out. He doesn't want church to be thought in those ethereal terms, cloudy and so on, mystical. Church isn't the mystical body of Christ. The church is the concrete, real, people-filled body of Christ. That's how he wants to keep it down to earth. Then he talks about baptism as the condition and guarantee for being in this body of Christ. Kung doesn't like the idea of broadening out this notion of the church to include everybody. When he doesn't like that idea that, well, the church is like everybody. Everybody of goodwill is in the church. Kung says that empties the language of any meaning. He said, and this is typical of him, he wants to be sort of hard and strict with his language and his definition. So he said that the people who are in the church are only those who have been baptized and profess belief in Jesus Christ explicitly. He never liked Rahner's notion of the anonymous Christian. As we'll see, Rahner and Kung got into great arguments as time went on. But Kung wanted to insist here that baptism is the way, it was the guarantee and the condition for being a member of the body of Christ. And the Lord's Supper was the way we really celebrated all of this. It was again, he didn't like the term Mass. Mass didn't come into the middle of the 4th or the 5th century, and he thinks we ought to be calling that the Lord's Supper. But that's, better describes what the Eucharist is all about. Then in this section, it's interesting, he takes up the question of heresy. And he said the problem with heresy is that the heretic comes up and makes his statement, the church reacts defensively against it, throws him out, and the kernel of truth that was in the heresy is then lost for centuries. It's a long and telling analysis of the value of heresy. That the heretics, as he pointed out, were very often committed people. They cared about the church and about Christianity, and they saw some aspect of it that was very crucial to them. And when the church just rules it out of court and shunts it aside, then that insight that's woven around, that valid point woven around the heretical point, is lost to the church, and we suffer as a result. So he wants us to be more open to the heretics. And that's, of course, the way he dealt with the reformers. He saw that when we just banished Luther, that we lost a whole lot. That Luther could have enriched our understanding. So it's only in the Second Vatican Council that we came back to many of the things that Luther had said and really, in one way or another, have incorporated them into our understanding of all of this. He says at one point, every Christian is potentially a heretic and an inquisitor. There's a big section there about the unfreedom in the church and the Inquisition and so on. And he says we're all in danger of that, of deviating from the truth, of not getting it just quite right, and also of being too defensive and attacking those who are different and seem to be outside the pale of the church. So for him, all of these various images are needed to keep alive what the notion of the church is all about. And he thinks that in using those three, that he's really given us a pretty comprehensive statement of what the church is. I'm going to stop there for a minute, and let's talk about the other sides of the argument. Yeah, it's the one that John was saying over there.
He said that the summation is drawn at the end of that whole section. The summation is so good that it would be viewed as the norm from now on to measure what is what's next to satisfaction and what's next to. I think that's going to go on.
I would certainly hope not. I mean, you see, what you'd be doing in a case like that is taking a small select group of people and letting them be the ones who make the judgment upon a 4-year council of all the bishops in the world. That's really, that would be going backwards. I mean, that's, when I get to the last part of my lecture, maybe that's the thing to emphasize. But that would be totally backwards. That would be going to a new authoritarianism in the worst way. That's a select group of people making a judgment. They're there for 2 weeks. Second Vatican Council met for 4 years with all of the expert input and all of the debate and votes and everything. This was a rubber stamp kind of thing. No, it wasn't that kind of open situation. There were people appointed to come. Just like in the United States. I mean, there were certain people who were just designated to be there. And so that, I mean, that would be terrible if that happened. Well, I mean, in one sense, it can't happen. I mean, you can't, there's no way that statement is going to override 16 council documents that we've been teaching and working on all these years. Let me go on with the story of Hans Kung. So we're in the 60s, and things are going fairly good, and we're got a nice program. We're going to have a reform of the church, and it's all going to get going, and so on. Then he attacks a problem that has been in place, difficulties that have been going on. In 1968, the Humane Vitae came out, and the birth control encyclical, which roughly related to the whole question of infallibility in a subtle way. I don't know how much technical thing to get in here, but while Humane Vitae was not seen to be infallible, the general teaching on birth control, which was said by the Pope in 1930, Costi Connubii, Pius XI, that many people did think was infallible, which said the same thing. And at least it was part of the ordinary general teaching of the Church and was commonly thought of by many people to partake of its general infallibility. Charles Davis left the Church over this. Some people recall that, shortly after the birth control encyclical. It's at that point that Kung, true to his general approach to things, said that what was the real problem behind the birth control thing was really the question of infallibility. Remember, the Pope John the 23rd set up a commission. I think it was, 65 people or so, and they voted about 60-4 to liberalize the Church's view. And the Pope Paul VI followed the 4, because the 4 argued that if you change your mind, then it will appear as though the Holy Spirit was with the Anglican Church in the Lambeth conferences in the 1930s and was not with the Roman Catholic Church. Because in 1930, the Anglicans came out and did say that there were certain times when birth control would be all right, and the Catholic Church in response said absolutely no. So the 4 argued that you can't change on this, because if you do, then it will seem as though the Spirit was not with the Catholic Church, and we are not infallible. Well, Kung took that up in his famous book, Infallible, ? An Inquiry, which he published around 1970, as I'm recalling it. Now, in that book, he bounced off of the birth control situation and said, we have to look honestly at this. Now, if we're going to be truthful, we got to get back and check this thing out. Truthfulness in the Church. So he went back, as usual, and did his historical studies. I think he found one really neat thing. I think it was about a pope in around 1438 who said that the whole notion of infallibility of the pope was the work of the devil. That was a pope saying that. And the background to it was that some of the Franciscans at that time wanted to show that the Pope was infallible so he wouldn't keep changing his mind all the time on his attitude towards their order. And so they were pushing. That's where infallibility first comes up, that notion. And I think in the 13th and 14th century. So the Pope, he doesn't want to get backed into a corner, So he says all this talk of infallibility is the work of the devil. Well, we go along, and we get up to 1870, and that's when the doctrine of infallibility was proclaimed. Now, he goes into all of the debate that went on. There's one theory that the council was not really free, that Pius IX was sort of senile by then and power-hungry, and he coerced the council, and there were a lot of dissent, but it wasn't allowed, and so on. In other words, Kung does a whole historical survey of that council. And then he ends up saying that in his opinion, it's impossible to have an infallible statement made by the Pope. That's impossible. And his main argument was you can't have that because language is so limited, that there's no statement that you could say is just infallibly collects the truth. Because our language, like if I got a deep thought in my heart and I want to try to convey it, well, I might get out part of it, but other part I can't say right, and the words I do use, you misinterpret, you don't get them right, and I end up, you don't really know what's in my heart after I've been trying to tell it to you. So Kung says when you do that kind of analysis of language, you end up saying it's just not possible for this to be. So he says what he wants to do now is to look at this and reinterpret it. And his positive answer to it is this. It's to go back to a traditional Catholic notion of indefectibility, which we've always taught or had in our minds, and that is that the church will always remain somehow under God's care. It will always remain in one way or another faithful to Jesus Christ. And it will do so despite errors, in spite of limitations, in spite of its mistakes. It will remain faithful in the truth. And Kung wants to say that's what counts. That's what that infallibility is really all about. It's got nothing to do with a sentence or a proposition. It has everything to do with the whole church being faithful finally to Christ, no matter what mistakes and sinfulness and errors are to be found there. So Kung's approach is to say what we need to say more often is that we were wrong. That the no salvation outside the church is one of his great ones that way. I mean, if I could find it quickly, I'd read it to you, but I remember hearing him lecture on this. And there's been that statement, no salvation outside the church. And it's been repeated over and over throughout the whole of Christian history. And then the Second Vatican Council comes along and says, just out of the blue in a sense, well, no, you can't have salvation outside the church. It says this, that God does not deny His grace of salvation even to those who have not yet learned to call Him by name, if they follow their conscience. So what Kung says is, you can't just leave that sit there. You got to do something with that. You know, and one of the things we need to do with that kind of thing is to say we were wrong at a given point, and we see it better now. Well, the church, that doesn't go too well with that. I mean, that's not the style of the church, as most people know. Anyway, he writes this book, Infallible in Inquiry, 1970. No, so now he's trying to deal with the downward trend. Remember, Andrew Greeley's research shows that the Catholic people in general in the United States accepted the reforms of Vatican II. That after the council, things were flourishing. People were still going to Mass, and they were getting more out of it, and we were on the upswing. Remember, the council ended in 1965. We're moving well. 1968 is when it all fell apart. Mass attendance, which was something like, for Catholics, an average of 73% a week, plummeted down to in the 50s. And it didn't change in 1966 when we changed, or in earlier 65 when we changed to English and all that. It changed in 68. And Greeley's theory is that it was all due to the birth control encyclical. That we had set up expectations through the commission, and the news media are picking up there'd probably be a change in that, new outlook, and the Pope came on, no to contraception. And that's when we got this fall of about 20% in regular Mass attendance. Well, you see, Kung is taking on the problem, in other words. He's trying to get at what stands behind us. And he's saying the problem is, the reason we can't make these adjustments when we should in line with the gospel is because we got the wrong notion of infallibility. So now he's starting to chronicle for us when it begins to fall apart. He once wrote in the Council Reform Union, the Council will either be a beacon of great hope or of tremendous disappointment to people. It's not going to just be another event. And of course what happened, it seems, is that this great expectation was set up that the church was going to modernize and be relevant to the times and so on, faithful to the gospel, and that fell apart. So Kung's now beginning his more negative critiques after the 60s when he's writing this rather positive material. Yeah, and he's representing, you see, my thesis throughout this whole thing is that he speaks for the progressives in the church. He's constantly written what people are feeling at any moment along this whole history throughout the council. So 1970, writes the book, and it's terrible fights it produces. The German bishops don't like it. The Rome doesn't like it at all. My mentor, Karl Rahner, is just appalled at it. And Rahner and Kung were very close, and Kung mentioned Rahner in one of his early books too, saying that that he learned from Rahner. He's his mentor, he's his teacher, even though he never studied under him. He's his major teacher in a way, and so they were very close. And over the infallibility thing, they fell out, and they got into this acrimonious fight in the journals, really calling each other bad names. And they really went Rahner said, we now have to talk to Kung on this issue as though we would talk to a liberal Protestant. And that hurt Kung. He says, this is the man who taught me to inquire. And here it is that I inquired, and now he's upset with me. I never asked Rahner about this because I knew it was such a sensitive issue. I do know that he was sick during this time, and he was in the hospital with stomach problems. And I've always thought that somehow he overreacted on this issue. Kung shot back by saying that Rahner was nothing but, this isn't going to mean anything to anybody, but he's nothing but a Denzinger theologian. That's about the worst thing you could say to somebody, because Denzinger is the name of a book that they started in 1854, which is just a collection of church statements. And what Kung said was that all Rahner was, in other words, is a court flunky. That he's just somebody who goes around repeating what the church officially has said. Well, I mean, that's just terrible. I mean, say that about Uncle Carl. I mean, I can't imagine that. Kung said that Rahner never takes the history of any question seriously. Rahner shot back and said, I've written more on the history of one question than Kung has in his whole life. And he may well have been right on that. So they got in this big fight in the journal. This isn't just in private, this is in the journals. And finally, they decided to call a truce, and both of them said they won the debate. They each said that they were right and had won, and it was over. I tell you a nice story. Kung told me himself that before Rahner died, that he went to see him and had lunch with him, took him out to lunch, and had a nice time with him, and they reconciled, and they were personally friendly again. That happened not too long before Rahner's death in 84. In between, I think the relationship was sort of strained. So everybody was really on Kung's back, and it produced all kind of articles and other books being written and so on. Rahner's statement was something like this, his defense. was that he doesn't think we ought to have infallible statements either. And he doesn't think the Pope should be making them. But what he insisted on is the possibility of making a statement that does infallibly represent what I'm feeling. So that I may not be able to tell you everything that I'm feeling, but if I'm very angry with you, and I say that I'm angry, and that word, we both know what angry means, and I really am angry, then I have a statement that infallibly represents what's in my heart. It's partial, it's incomplete, I might change it tomorrow in a way, I'd be in a different feeling, but for now it infallibly collects what I have to say. That's fundamentally, in a very simple fashion, what this very deep, long argument was about. And that's something that they really never reconciled. But it set up a whole period of time in which Kung was under great fire. In the 70s, then, I need to jump ahead to show you how this went through the 70s. He published then in 1974 a really important book called On Being a Christian. So now he got out of just talking about the church, and he started to write about the things that mean something to the rest of us. So what he wanted to say is, what's it like to be a Christian in the modern world? How would we live it out? What's the core of our belief? And that's that marvelous work that he did, and which is one of the fine summaries, I suppose, of what Christianity is all about for our own time. Now, the German bishops took great exception to some of the things in that book on being a Christian. And their major problem with it was that he talked about who Jesus was in functional terms. That is, that he wanted to say that Jesus acted like the final prophet, he functioned as the absolute Savior, but he didn't want to get into saying in philosophical terms what you could say about Jesus. Now, he got into a big fight with the German bishops, and it went on for a number of years, really. And they kept going back. It was just like the current debate now. They would send him letters, and he would answer, and they wouldn't like his answers, and finally they just pinned it down. 3 questions. Will you affirm that Jesus is the Son of God? And so on. And Kung kept writing back, well, I can't answer him that way. I have to give longer explanations. It's not that simple. And so they kept going, and by 1975, they sort of came to a stalemate. They didn't do anything to him, they didn't discipline him or not, but they issued a letter to the German people saying that this book on being a Christian does not represent a full statement of the faith. They were nice to him. They said it said a lot of good things, but it's not a full statement of the faith. At the same time, Rome was very upset about the infallibility book. And they kept a dossier on him and kept inquiring, and he had to send letters back and forth to them. In fact, when you read the story of the 1970s, you get the impression that Kung spent all of his time writing letters back and forth to Rome and to the German bishops, trying to solve this dispute. But as a matter of fact, during that time, he also wrote a number of other fine books. One on eternal life, and Does God Exist? Yeah, important book that he also wrote in the 70s, 1978, I think, the Does God Exist? So again, he's taking up these big questions, but he's in this whole long debate. So it appeared as though there was sort of a draw. Nothing happened. He continued to teach. I fill in the story. He taught at Tübingen, a university in Germany, and it's an ecumenical university. They have a Protestant faculty and a Catholic faculty, and they have seminarians coming from different denominations. And they also had an ecumenical institute, and Hans Kung was the head of that. That was his post. So he's doing his teaching, doing his writing. He's under great pressure from Vatican, from the German bishops, from the right wing in the church, constantly challenged. But he's making it okay. And then in December of 1979. Now this is after the current Pope got in. I keep having to fill in. Paul VI never did anything about this because Paul VI didn't want big fights and ruptures and schisms in the church. So it appears as though during that time he might have been sort of a protector of Kung, so that he didn't really get sacked or anything. Then Paul VI dies, 1978. We have the new Pope, Pope John Paul II, after the other one, who was in for just a month. We get the new Pope. And very shortly afterwards, out of the blue, with no hearing, no anything, not even the German bishops weren't informed, a handwritten letter comes to Kung. He isn't even there. He's out skiing. And it says that his right to teach as a Catholic theologian, his canonical mission, so to speak, has been revoked. And he can no longer teach in the Catholic faculty at Tübingen. Well, I mean, it was just a total shock. I remember that's when I was interviewed in the Blade, and they were theologians all over the world. 2,000 students demonstrated for Kung in the next couple days. Theologians around the world signed petitions saying that this was out of line and so on. There was no hearing, there was no proper procedure. All the way along the line, Kung kept saying, I'll come to Rome and discuss it with you if there's certain conditions, if I can have counsel there with me, and if I can have a right to see my file before I get there and see what people have against me, and if there's a time limit on it. In other words, he set up about 5 conditions where he said he'd be happy to come to Rome and talk about it, but they would never go along with that. And so finally comes this thing where he is deprived of his post. Now this, really took its toll. I think you have to understand that Kung is a loyal person in the church. In other words, they always say you have to criticize the church out of loyalty. He was very much against Charles Davis when he left the church. He didn't think that's the way you should do it. He says, no, you shouldn't leave the church. You can't. You should stay in the church and try to improve it. He didn't like this idea of leaving. And so this taking away of his right to teach in that way was a very difficult thing for him, very hurtful kind of event in his life. After that, the people rallied to his support and all of this. None of it made much difference. But what they did do was straighten it out in Tübingen, so he kept his post. That he's still the director of the Ecumenical Institute, and they took it out from under the authority of the Catholic faculty, so it's an independent entity, and now he can continue to teach there. So they found a way to keep him. Although I know for a fact that his position is precarious, and he's worried about it. In fact, when he came up to the University of Michigan to teach for a semester, he came up under only one condition, that they would offer him tenure there, so that he had an out, because he was afraid they were going to get rid of him entirely in Tübingen, so he would have a place to teach. Maybe that's enough to bring us through the 70s. So what does that say? Well, that begins to say the time of dissent in the church, of condemnations, of certain disappointments setting in about the direction of the Second Vatican Council, sharper polarization in our parishes, conservatives and progressives, liberals not always getting along perhaps as we should, strong right-wing reactions to liberal theologians, people being denounced to the bishops and so on. I remember getting somebody denounced me to the apostolic delegate in Washington, and the thing got back, and then he got it back to the bishop or something, and this whole, it ends up not amounting to anything. The apostolic delegate puts it in the hands of the bishop, and he has to figure out what to do about it. But that's sort of the climate of the times. It was a time when the reform of the Second Vatican Council some ways, the disappointment, I guess, came in. Well, let's stop there in our history and allow people to catch up with that. And, oh my heavens. And see if we have any questions out of.
And that he was no longer allowed to teach at the Catholic University. But where do you say the seminarians
No, there are seminarians studying there, but there are other people as well. There's about 800 students, I think, something like that.
When it came out, he was removed from the post of the professor of the seminary.
Well, no, it was removed from the Catholic faculty. It's that he was taken out of. Yeah, he couldn't. In fact, that's why that ecumenical institute had to be moved. It was really under the heading of the Catholic faculty. It had to be given a different setting. That's my understanding of it. But that meant he could not. One of the things was that he could no longer examine Catholic seminarians. Now that came into play. In other words, part of his job would have been to supervise them in one way or another, or be part of their exams, and he could not do that anymore.
Because we're talking about seminarians, that's a whole different ballgame. Like, answer the question I'm referring to.
Yeah.
We have to differentiate between teaching given in a catechetical situation and teaching given in a conversion situation. I'm teaching a convert, I really should present the pure doctrine of the orthodoxy, whereas in so here too, if you're talking about seminarians, I would like to think the tradition of seminarians the expectation that at least once in their life they expose the orthodox, later on
Well, I think the accurate statement, I mean, we can check this, is that he was removed from the Catholic faculty. Their universities there are different from our situation. So, I mean, if Gerard Sloyan teaches at Temple in Philadelphia, well, he's just a member of the faculty of the School of Religion there. And, I mean, he happens to be a Catholic. But they're all amalgamated together. At Tübingen, it was originally a Protestant school, and then they brought in a Catholic faculty at one time. So the faculties are really distinct. There's a Protestant faculty and a Catholic faculty. That's where you have your post, and it's that he was removed from. Now, he didn't just teach seminarians, but seminarians did go through there and were part of that program. But I think the decree was that he explicitly could not partake in their exams or be part of their training. And the argumentation is the same as we're hearing with Charles Kern today. Yes? Yeah. Well, very good question. He was of the opinion that the way what you had to do was to get at the essential gospel that is embedded in that New Testament. And in that New Testament, there's going to be some things that are less important than others, and there's also going to be error within that. So that the real work, the real way you got at it was through the scholars. That the scholars, using the historical critical method, could help us get back to that original gospel that is contained there in the New Testament, sort of embedded in the midst of the whole of that New Testament. Thus, he thought that the scholars, the people who would do things as you're suggesting, distinguish out for us what is particular literary form, what is exaggeration, etc., would be very valuable people. And so the answer is fundamentally yes. He did think you had to make those distinctions so that you couldn't just take it sort of in an uncritical way and say, there it is, the New Testament, it's the judge for what we're doing. Because the reason you can't do that is because there's contradictory trends in it. Now, this is a very disputed point in theology. It would be one of the ways I would be very critical of Kung. I mean, I don't think that is a very good way of doing it. I don't think that's an adequate way of thinking about it. In other words, I want to see as our criterion the much more of an ongoing tradition. That is, an ongoing way in which we continue to interpret those scriptures. And I want to see the whole of the New Testament as playing a role in that. And that the real job is to balance the perspectives, or to see the various perspectives. So if you want to quote to me James, then about true religion is feed the orphans or take care of the orphans and widows. Someone else wants to quote Paul to me that we're saved by faith alone. Then I say we got to get them both into the picture, and any one-sided approach is going to be wrong historically. But for sure, Kung thought that the scholars, by sorting that all out, would put that together for us. And they would be the ones, in other words, that would end up coming up with sort of what the criterion is. Now, that's not a happy position to be in. I don't think we want the whole business to be in the hands of theologians and Scripture scholars. Oh, that's too great a role. As I often say, theology is all right. It's nice to have people like me around when you got questions and doubts and for classes like this. But there's something more primary than that. And the thing that is more primary is the faith. It's the lived faith of the whole Catholic community, of the whole church, really. I misspoke there, of the whole of the Christian community that needs to be taken into consideration. And the people who have generally had the job of speaking that are the bishops. They're the ones who have had the task of proclaiming the message. In other words, their job, like in our diocese now, you got Jim Huffman and you got me, a theologian. Now my job is to be thinking critically. My job is to be, advancing things, maybe taking some risks and trying some ideas out. Well, if you're looking for a judge or a guide, that already makes me sort of unreliable in a way, because I'm trying to create something. Jim Huffman's job is to hold it together, to hear all the voices, to keep it in touch with the tradition. Understand? Karl Rahner used to say, when it comes down to a dispute between the bishop and the professor, the bishop has the last word. So fundamentally, I end up disagreeing with Kung when it gets technical, and that is when his technical answer to the question is that the norm is the canon within the canon as it's determined and figured out by the exegetes, by the biblical scholars. And that, I would say, no. I would say the norm becomes the witness of the apostolic church, of the early church, the early followers of Jesus, as proclaimed by the church throughout its history, as reinterpreted throughout its history. That's where I would end up differing with him on that. And that's really crucial. I mean, and that, of course, is what has gotten Kung into all of the trouble. So I agree. The norm is the New Testament. That's the primary witness to Jesus. But as a matter of fact, as time goes on, sometimes we see it better than some of them did. A good example of that is happening right now with the liberation theology. In other words, a lot of them didn't see the implications. They didn't know that the teaching of Jesus meant that slavery was out. They didn't know that. Paul said to the slave, go back to your master. In other words, it's not true that the closer you are to an event, that the better you know it, in my opinion. Sometimes distance and time makes you know the event better. So I really do think we today understand some things better about what Jesus stood for than those guys who knew him personally. I mean, you could probably think of examples where that happens, where after a period of time you would know something better than you did earlier. And I think that's a good example. My example is a really good one. That is, they didn't know that the message of Jesus meant slavery was out. We do. So that's why I'm not ready to settle just for what I think is that sort of narrow view that Kung has, which I think is generally the problem that the Protestant community has had in finding out what the norm is for how we should live. So today, if someone said, for example, we should have slavery again because Paul told the slave to go back to his master, I'd say wrong. That's wrong. And I think almost everyone would say wrong, but it's important to know why it's wrong. And the reason is because you can come to know the truth better over a period of time. What do I do with the 80s? Let's write off the 80s. Feel free to leave. I'll just do 5 minutes yet on the 80s. People got to go places or getting freezing to death. I'll just reduce it down to this. In 1985, before the Synod in Rome that we were talking about, Kung published an article, typical Kung again. He's sort of abrasive, comes on strong, and is really comparing the pontificate of Pope John Paul II to the previous one. He said we had the 7 good years with John the 23rd in the council, and now we've had 7 lean years with John Paul II. And then he rehearses all of the ways in which he sees him trying to go back on things, or the centralization in Rome. And he goes to Africa and won't use the African liturgy. He comes to the United States and distributes communion and embarrasses people by not putting it in their hand, even though we've been doing it in our country for long periods of time. Won't listen to people when he travels around. He goes and just tells them. He doesn't listen to what they are all about. So Kung goes on, but saying how that we're in big trouble. And he says the main issue of the 80s, and that the pontificate of John Paul II will be judged on, is the question of women. And he says, look at what he has done. He's refused to look at the ordination of women. They've been against girls serving, which is one of the more ridiculous things you can think of. He's clamping down on the women religious orders time and again. And Kung says that is, will be the real test of his pontificate. And he gives him very low marks for that. Then he says what that has done is that the average person is not being heard. The average Catholic who's upset with life in their parish are not being heard. And the bishops find themselves in the middle between those people and the Vatican. And he just sort of puts it to them, what are you going to do? Are you going to act courageously, or are you going to cave in? And that's pretty much how he sets up this whole thing. I was thinking of reading some parts of this to you. He ends this article. He says, he reads a statement that a group of priests in Munich gave. He says, the priest said this: our pastoral practice has let us see a good many of the unhappy side effects of the conciliar renewal. But we also know that a church that wants to turn back from Vatican II divorces itself from modern society and will be reduced to marginal significance. And those who, like Ratzinger, exalt themselves in such a triumphalistic manner above everything that is not or does not seem to be Roman Catholic exclude themselves as dialogue partners. So he picks up on that, and he says, therefore, in solidarity with these fellow clerics and with